So first, let me thank you very much for the chance to talk to the C-STAR audience, especially to such a productive group of researchers, language researchers, aphasiologists in this country. In fact, one of the more productive groups anywhere. Dr. Denowden was right that he first asked me to talk about apraxia of speech. And since I don't have active research going in that area right now, I asked if it would be of interest to talk about something that I am working on. And maybe reluctantly, I hope not, he agreed that I could talk about the task impurity problem in aphasia testing and the search for the cognitive underpinnings of what I believe are the sources of the language impairment in people with aphasia. So in this presentation, I'm going to appeal to a very old, moldy oldie notion that the language problems that people with aphasia have is one of language processing and not one of language loss in the sense of losing the rules or the representations for the language. Sometimes characterized as the competence-performance dichotomy, and in many circles, long abandoned. But I want to revive that for today's talk. I'll present some arguments that this dichotomy is useful, and I'll try and bolster the arguments with some research evidence that supports it, along with task requirements that are required for discovering what might account for the language processing deficits that actually define the phenomenon of interest, that is aphasia. I'll very briefly discuss some evidence that points to memory and attention deficits that have been proposed to explain these cognitive processing deficits in people with aphasia. However, the ubiquitous task impurity problem in behavioral testing requires us to look for the cognitive mechanisms that subtend even these cognitive mechanisms of memory and attention deficits that are associated with the language deficits in people with aphasia. I'll present some likely candidates, some evidence that they may indeed underlie the language deficits, and the development of a short battery of tests that measure some cognitive functions, along with some data from normal aging, aphasia, left hemisphere damage, people without aphasia, mild TBI and PTSD that illustrate the utility of the battery. So the take-home message, I'll give you straight up for today's presentation, is that because no test measures only what it purports to test, only what it's called, what it's labeled, that is the task impurity problem. In an understanding of the impaired underlying cognitive operations that are required for processing or doing language, may be better positioned to find an aphasia classification system, for example, that's neurobiologically grounded, and behavioral measures that better identify treatment targets and measure change associated with treatment. If we focus on those cognitive mechanisms instead of the linguistic level disorders per se. So that was me. So jumping straight ahead, the loss versus impairment or impaired access view in people with aphasia. There are several reasons to believe that the language representations and the rules for the language that we use to build structure are essentially preserved in people with aphasia. Frequently characterized as an access deficit, but most obviously seen in word recall or naming deficits, but observable in all modalities and across all domains of language. So what is that evidence? this is at least the logic, some logical arguments for it. First, language can be primed. If language can be primed, it must mean it's there to be primed. And it seems that we have evidence that we can prime all domains of language. We also have well-established metalinguistic information that's available, even when the full target isn't available. The argument that language can be recovered, sometimes within minutes, as in post-ictal aphasia or after TIAA, certainly argues that language isn't lost. It isn't somehow deleted or permanently disordered in some way. And the one that I'm going to concentrate on is that language performance is variable from moment to moment within a given individual, given the same task requirements. So what is this within subject variability? Access to behaviors that patients demonstrate that they can do in some occasions, but don't do often, is one way to look at this problem. But what we do need is a set of homogeneous tasks with homogeneous stimuli using the same set of stimuli, either within that one task or on repeated trials under the exact same stimulus response and contextual conditions. So what do we need? What are the task requirements to measure this within subject variability that I believe is a good argument for looking at performance deficits as opposed to competence deficits in people with aphasia? Well, first we have to have a sufficient number of trials or test items within a test theorized and demonstrated to measure the same construct. For example, comprehension of compound imperative sentences or a naming task. Demonstrated to be homogeneous in terms of difficulty, typically measured by measures of internal consistency with odd, even, or split half reliability measures. Many, perhaps most aphasia tests don't meet the requirement for homogeneity within a subtest. Most select stimuli to assess the construct of interest, for example, syntactic comprehension or sentence length capacity, but using stimuli with subtests that have substantially different and varying, let's say, lexical demands and response requirements. An example of this would be part 5 of the Dorenzi and Faglioni version of a token test, where they have a few items that are adverbial clauses, a few that are prepositional phrases, a few that are simple declarative comprehension sentences. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with sampling a variety of lexical items designed to measure a particular ability, such as naming ability, such as is done with the Boston naming test, as long as it's reliable. But it won't work for detecting within subject variability, because those words are graded in difficulty. So without sufficient homogeneous items, the task is likely to either over or underestimate and represent abilities if variable performance is produced by something other than the task per se. So one test that does meet the homogeneity requirement for indexing within subject variability is, as Dirk mentioned, the revised token test. In this case, the computerized revised token test. Another one with the established within subtest homogeneity would be the PICA. So the CRTT employs a very finite, concrete, high frequency of occurrence set of vocabulary items. Same response stimuli, identical test administration procedures, 10 homogeneous commands within each subtest, previously demonstrated to be homogeneous items. That is, not different in difficulty across subjects, and uses a fairly sensitive 15-point multidimensional scoring system with which to capture small amounts of variance rather than the typical plus-minus right-wrong response, which disguises the kind of variability that I'm interested in looking at. So this allows for an exploration of why there's within subject variability in performance and an exploration of the cognitive underpinnings for that variability. So let me first momentarily digress for a second. Because we're talking about token tests, and this is just a pet peeve of mine, and indulge me for a second. The token test, with the definite article the, does not nor never has existed. There is no such thing as the token test. Terenzi and Vignola published a paper suggesting a framework for such a test. Because they didn't specify the specific dimensions, colors, sizes, textures of the stimuli, even the commands or the speed with which the commands are given. When people create, produce a token test, they produce it with great variance. And so while you will notice in the literature that there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of articles with the token test, usually with a reference to Terenzi and Vignola, I just want you to know that that doesn't exist. There is no such test. They provided a brilliant idea and told you to go construct items that look like that. But that construction creates enormous variance in the way the test is administered and the way it's scored and talked about. So my pet peeve is taken care of. There is no such thing as the token test. There has to be a specific token test that's been researched adequately to be called a token test. Now, there are a number that are published that qualify, but they would have references for them. So, all right, with that off my chest, is there variability in what accounts for it? There was a concerted research effort back in the 1970s and 80s to document and describe patterns of performance variability, particularly associated with auditory processing. Schul and Brookshire and Porch and others described several patterns of performance that were hypothesized to reflect underlying cognitive impairments. For example, the stimulus-independent patterns were potentially related to attention and memory, and those constructs have been pursued since that to explain some of these profiles. Schul talked about an intermittent profile where performance was on and off across homogeneous sets of items. Porch talked about something that he called slow rise time or tuning in, and that is a progressive improvement over successive items. He also talked about cumulative noise or fading out, which is the opposite pattern where performance begins high and over successive items decreases. There are a number of possible explanations, mechanisms for that pattern, habituation, fatigue, or something that he wanted to call cumulative noise. So by looking at the variability of performance across the items, across 10 items, within a subtest on the revised token test, whose, as I said before, item homogeneity had been established, and by looking at the variability from test to retest, the difference between what the patient demonstrated they could do versus what they only sometimes did, an index of loss versus performance deficit was calculated. And I won't spend time going through this, but it was just a formula for deriving the percentage of information that they got sometimes, but didn't necessarily get, and then to quantify that. So the first thing we did way back when in the 80s was we took 30 left hemisphere damaged persons with aphasia who demonstrated deficits on the revised token test, and 30 right hemisphere damaged persons without aphasia who also demonstrated deficits on the RTT. And we hypothesized that the right hemisphere group should be nearly 100%, their deficits should be nearly 100% attributable to what we're going to call a performance deficit, or that is things that they showed they did most of the time at the sentence level, versus people with aphasia's deficits, we hypothesized to be one of fundamentally impaired, if it was one of fundamentally impaired rules or representations, their variability index should be low. So the right hemisphere guys we predict should have a very high internal state factor, as we call them. And if aphasic deficits are things that they never do, never show you they can do, then their index should be low. So given that index, what we showed across those 10 subtests and across the overall was that for the right hemisphere non-aphasic population, 98% of what they did was attributable to a performance deficit. But surprisingly, 87% on the average across subtests of what the aphasic subjects showed that they sometimes did versus could do was attributable to a performance deficit. So I guess conservatively, we could say that 87% of the aphasic and 98% of the right hemisphere individuals' performance deficits on this task were attributable to things they showed that they could do, but oftentimes didn't do. Something other than the fundamental deficits of the rules and representations of language would seem to be necessary to account for this performance deficit. So from a series of studies with normal subjects under single and divided task conditions, right hemisphere non-aphasic and left hemisphere aphasic subjects, we, meaning myself and several other researchers, including prominently Carlin Hagman, showed that those patterns hypothesized by Schul and Porch and Brookshire and others were not specific to the presence of aphasia. That is, we found patterns in people who were right hemisphere damaged and even people who had no brain damage. So it wasn't specific to the presence of brain damage, wasn't specific to the hemisphere that's lesioned, and it's not even specific to the linguistic or non-linguistic nature of the task. The exact nature of the language task for example, sentence comprehension or non-recognition, didn't seem to matter to the production of these patterns. So what we were able to conclude from a whole series of studies that I won't take time to review, found that the frequency of fluctuations is reliable within an individual. However, the amplitude of the fluctuations, that is how much deficit they showed, was not reliable. The pattern types for groups were found to be reliable. If you take groups of people, right hemisphere or aphasic, left hemisphere aphasic or right hemisphere damaged people. However, individuals were not, save for the intermittent pattern type. So we concluded that the most prominent and perhaps the only real pattern is the intermittent pattern. Other pattern types appear to be artifacts of the timing of the of whatever is causing this intermittent pattern of comprehension failure, possibly due to some biological rhythms, and we speculated about a number of possible mechanisms for that. Well, if linguistics are intact, if the language is intact or substantially intact, what other cognitive factors might affect the measurement of sentence comprehension, either reading or listening? So you're all very familiar with the plethora of studies on memory, short-term, working, declarative, procedural memory. And the one that for a very long time I favored was attention, executive attention, or resource allocation as a potential explanation for this intermittent pattern that seems to account for the deficits that we see in people with aphasia. Other factors certainly could be perceptual deficits or motor speed or the access to world knowledge that we use to govern, to process information, language information, or becoming more and more popular are issues about motivation and depression. And there are, of course, many other possibilities that could underlie a performance deficit for language. As I said, attention and memory predominate the literature, and in fact, a list of people, a very short list of people, and many, many others have studied attention and memory, and in both cases have found substantive relationships, substantive associations with language performance in people with aphasia. So for illustration purposes only, I'll briefly show a couple of slides from studies that we've conducted that support the notion that memory impairments are related to language deficits. I'll skip the attention literature because that's been talked about so extensively. So in 2009 study that was led by Jiun Sung, using the computerized revised token test. And by the way, I'm talking predominantly about the computerized revised token test, not because I want it to be an advertisement for the work that I do, but because I want to restrict it to a relatively small set of tasks that we can explore systematically and parametrically. But I will say that I believe the generalizations that I'm making apply to other tasks if we have the right format for looking at them. So we found in that study a relationship between sentence level working memory and sentence comprehension with a low working memory group showing significantly lower CRTT scores, but only on sentences with greater task demands. Those hypothesized to require it. In this case, it's the prepositional phrase. Maybe this is showing the prepositional phrases in sentences represented by subtest 5 and 6. And this was for the listening CRTT. For the reading computerized revised token test, we see a similar thing, but in addition, subtests requiring adverbial clause comprehension also show this disparity between high and low working memory groups of people with aphasia. So the tasks constructed right appear to appear to show at least an association between working memory and aphasia. Again, this has been shown many times across many domains of language. But even these cognitive tasks, or these cognitive domains, I might say, are not purely measured constructs. So memory, whatever way we want to frame it, require retrieval and storage, and more recently, prominently, updating functions and maintenance functions and others. Likewise, attention or executive attention utilizes the rate of information activated and the rate of information inhibited. Constructs about conflict resolution are prominent. Goal maintenance, response selection, and execution are sub-processes that may hold relevance for explaining a performance deficit in people with aphasia. Okay, let me catch up with myself. So not even with the established item homogeneity of the test could we confidently attribute performance deficits to, let's say, attention or memory deficits. So we hypothesized what subordinate cognitive processes might contribute to the impaired or the variable performance that we see on the CRTT, on the computerized revised token test. So we hypothesized that there were 6 domains, 5 domains really, of cognitive processes that likely contribute to performance on the computerized revised token test. I will say that I believe that these same cognitive processes apply to almost all aphasia tests, though we don't usually explore them and they're just subsumed within the task that the test is labeled as. So the things that we decided to look at was first just plain motor speed. We looked at movement control because all of our tests require some level of response, unless we're doing eye tracking or some non-movement response, which is rare in aphasia testing. And it's even more prominent with acting out tasks like the computerized revised token test, where a manual response has to be given. Simple reaction time is another domain of cognition that could account for performance deficits in aphasics. As we said before, attention and especially response inhibition holds a great interest for me, and often measured by a variety of tasks, including the Stroop tasks and others. And then simple response mapping. And then another task is a more complex version of the response mapping task. And I will explain those to you now. So the first task, simple motor speed, is measured with a tap on the mouse. And the instructions are to tap as fast as you can for 10 seconds, and that's repeated 3 times. The second task, the simple reaction time, stimulus response reaction time, is to tap the mouse as quickly as you can when you see a circle or a square appear in the center of the screen. And it varies among all of the tokens in the task. So either a circle or a square appears, no distinction. Just tap the mouse as quickly as you can when you see it. So that's just simple reaction time. And then the next one is a token tap. That is, because there is a response required in a test, we wanted to extract how much that could account for it. So it's when you see the stimulus on the screen, move the mouse as fast as you can and tap on that object. It's always one object in the center of the screen. The fourth task is a go, no-go task, where they're given the instructions to tap either and only a circle or a square, but within a subtest, only, let's say, only the circle when the circle appears on the screen, and to inhibit the response when a square appears on the screen. So that one we think has something to do with inhibition, among other tasks, I have to say. The one stimulus to response mapping, simple, is a task where a circle or a square appears on the screen, and the left mouse button is assigned to the circle, and the right mouse button is assigned to the square. And so when you see a circle, you tap the right mouse button. When you see a square, you tap the left. So there's some response mapping requirements there. And the next one is when 2 stimuli appear, but you always go left to right. So whichever one occurs first, if it's a square and then a circle, you tap the right button and then the left button. If it's 2 squares, you tap the right button twice. And so it just adds some complexity to the task. Okay, there's also the possibility of deriving some other cognitive functions from these tasks. And I will illustrate that for you. I won't describe them in great detail here. But for example, stimulus detection is just the time it takes to detect the stimulus, but not necessarily respond to that. So we think we can get an estimate of that by subtracting the tap time, the interval, tap interval, from the time it takes to react to the stimulus and the simple response time. So that's SOAP 1 minus, SOAP means speed of processing, subtest 1 versus speed of processing, subtest 2. We can figure out the controlled movement by subtracting subtest 3 from subtest 2. We can get at goal maintenance or conflict resolution by subtracting subtest 4 from subtest 2, etc. And I will illustrate that for you in a moment. This simply shows the score sheet, which I really don't need to show you. So I will skip that and show you what the data might look like for this task, and I'll explain the derived measures. So these are data from an older person whose reaction times do not match the undergraduate students that we have. They're slower. And this older person by admission is me. So you can see that the tap time is around 200 milliseconds. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but it's tap time here. The reaction time is around 230 milliseconds. The move time, of course, which would be the longest, is over 1,000 milliseconds to see the stimulus and move to it and click on it. The go, no-go task is around 400 milliseconds, etc. across the task. You can see that it's almost a linear thing, save for the movement. The derived scores are taken from the difference. So detection time is the difference between the tap time, the tap interval, and the reaction time. And you can see it's somewhat less than 100 milliseconds. So that's how long it took me to just detect the stimulus. When you subtract the reaction time from the simple reaction time from the move and tap on it, you can get the pure movement time here, which is around almost 800 milliseconds, which is different from the 1,100 or 1,000 plus milliseconds. The inhibition time, again, is the difference between the go, no-go task and the reaction time. And so that one is around 200 milliseconds. So you can start to get estimates of these subcognitive processes. If you use these tasks, and assuming that they are in fact reliable and measure what they say they measure, which we believe they do. So from a series of studies conducted by some undergraduate honors and master's thesis students that are students of Professor Sheila Pratt, we've collected a bunch of data on normal aging. And just to cut to the chase, we plotted it on a Brinley plot, and these are the response times from those 6 tasks. There's 7 measures here because the complex mapping task has two responses, the first and the second tap. You can see that if in fact there was, this is the younger group is plotted, their times are plotted on the abscissa, and on the ordinate, we have the older group. If they were equivalent, they would fall on this line. If the older people are slower than the younger people, it will of course be on this side of the line. And we see that for the right hand and the left hand is almost always longer, even for equivalent tasks. But they do fall on a pretty similar regression line. You can also see that the older people, that there is an aging effect on these tasks. So age matters. Hand is also matters. Hand is significantly different between the young and the old. Just real quickly to go through some of this, I'll do it very quickly. Here we have the tap interval. We can see that the right hand and the left hand, when the old and young people are combined, there's no correlation with scores or times on the computerized revised token test. So here we're looking for relationships between these tasks and performance on the language task. However, when we look at the young and the old for the simple reaction time, you can see that the old folks, older subjects who were in 65 plus and the younger were 30 to 45. The older folks, as indicated by the shaded correlations, showed significant and relatively moderate to high correlations with language task performance. Let me catch up here. So on the movement task, you can also see that there's a right hand and a left hand effect, and it correlates moderately with computerized revised token test reading scores and times. You'll notice the negative correlations with the scores, and of course the positive with the times. The higher the time, the higher the response time or the comprehension times on the computerized revised token test. Looking at the inhibition, just as an example, again, there is a significant and modest correlation between scores and times on the computerized revised token test. Again, with the complex mapping derived scores, you can see that there is significant and mild, moderate correlations with CRTT reading scores and reading times. And just to show that not everything correlates, that is, everything isn't everything. Everything isn't related to a third variable that we're actually measuring. You can see that for the second mapping task, first response, there are significant correlations, but for the accuracy of those mapping scores, there is no significant correlations with the computerized revised token test. Likewise with the second response. So I can see we're getting closer to our time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. I'm going to talk about a study that Sue Yu did for her dissertation, where she looked at non-linguistic and linguistic tasks. At speed of processing in both linguistic and non-linguistic tasks, she used 6 non-linguistic tasks that I describe here. The first 3 are the first three from the speed of processing battery. And then there was a pattern recognition and the colored progressive matrices, the ravens, as another so-called non-linguistic task. And then there were 6 linguistic tasks that were designed to be similar in difficulty and structure to the non-linguistic tasks. So there was a letter comparison, A and B, longer strings, lexical decisions with lower frequencies for the harder lexical decisions, and then a sentence completion task. So again, using a Brinley plot, we can see that when, I failed to mention that she used left hemisphere damaged people with aphasia, left hemisphere damaged people without aphasia, and normal healthy controls. So we compare the non-aphasic left hemisphere damaged people to the normal healthy controls. Again, you can see that, in fact, there is a slowing for as an effect of the left hemisphere damage. This would be the line if there were no differences between the normal healthy controls on the abscissa and the left hemisphere damaged non-aphasics on the ordinal. So there is a substantive slowing, and the slowing pretty much is systematic across linguistic and non-linguistic tasks. The simpler tasks for both language and non-language, of course, are less divergent from the normal healthy controls. When we look at the people with aphasia on the ordinate and the normal healthy controls, there's a substantive, a large of 1.4 times, slowing compared to the normal healthy control across the tasks, to form a fairly consistent regression line. When we subtract, or when we compare the people with aphasia to the left hemisphere damaged people, the people with aphasia were even more slowed, which suggests to us that the additional slowing compared to the left hemisphere non-aphasic group is significant. And although we don't have a good lesion, we don't have good lesion data on these subjects, inspection of lesion size or lesion location doesn't appear to explain the difference, because we did have subjects with larger lesions who performed, and subjects with less lesions who did not fit the expected pattern that you would see if lesion size was the effect. So it appears that there's an over-additive effect of people with aphasia in terms of slowing on these non-linguistic tasks. In another study, and I will skip through this one quickly, Sheila Pratt is doing a multi-site study looking at hearing complaints in people with mild TBI and PTSD. Under quiet and listening conditions, one of the tasks is under quiet and listening conditions using the computerized revised token test. So you can see that across the groups, PTSD plus MTBI, PTSD only, MTBI only, and the normal controls, there's really no significant difference in scores, either under quiet or under the noise condition. But I should back up and say that the reason they're doing this study is because these patients perform normally on standard audiometric testing, but they have substantive complaints of hearing impairment. So they're looking for other explanations for why they're for the complaints in the presence of normal hearing by standard audiometric procedures. In both quiet and babble, you can see that the time, now in noise, not the scores, not the accuracy, but the time, the PTSD only group were significantly faster, both in quiet and in babble, compared to the other groups. When we look at the simple motor speed, the tap interval, inner tap interval, that's how we measure that. There's no difference in basic motor speed among the four groups. Likewise, there's no substantive difference no significant difference or no substantive difference among them in the pure movement time. That's the derived time it takes to move for controlled limb movement. However, in the simple reaction time, the PTSD subjects are significantly faster, that is in simple reaction time, compared to the MTBI or the group with both. Likewise, when we do the derived detection time, the PTSD subjects are significantly faster than the other three groups. Now, this one is a surprise to me. I had believed that detection time was such a basic process, it would probably be almost immutable, but it certainly fits with the notion of hypervigilance of PTSD. These are preliminary data, and there will be data added to them, so I don't know that these data will stand, but it's clear that some subjects, at least, perform in this manner. So I'm going to skip the summary and go right to the basic take-home message, so we have at least a couple minutes for questions. So the take-home message, as I stated earlier, is that no test measures only what it purports to measure. That's the task impurity problem. We must begin to routinely assess the impaired underlying cognitive operations that are required for understanding the processing or the doing of language. If we do so, we might be better positioned to find neurobiologically underpinnings of aphasia, which should provide behavioral measures that better identify treatment targets and perhaps measure change associated with that treatment better than at the extended level that we use now, which is the language. Now, that does not mean that we abandon language or communication descriptions of aphasia or that they're irrelevant for treatment. It does suggest that we explore the utility of focusing on those cognitive operations that subtend the language level descriptions. This brings up a host of other problems about domain specificity, about domain generality of these non-linguistic tasks. We can talk about that. It's my basic belief that if we're going to treat the language of aphasics, we have to employ perhaps these cognitive mechanisms in the context of doing language tasks that require those specific cognitive operations that may be impaired, that may be vulnerable in people with aphasia. So with that, I thank you for your time and I invite your questions.
Thank you. One question by Julius.
So hi, Nick. This is Julius Fredrickson. Thank you for a wonderful talk. At the end, you talked about how we could isolate possibly the operations that I think you worded it as subtend the linguistic level disorder. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by that?
I can try. Yes. So if we have a problem with inhibiting, is that me? I hope that's not me. If we have a problem with inhibition in, let's say, lexical retrieval, as we measure with the Stroop task, I think it may be worth thinking about designing language tasks that manipulate that particular variable. And I'll give you an example of how I think we might manipulate that particular variable. We only see Stroop effects when people are fast readers. The Stroop effect goes away if you're a slow reader. You don't see it. So we could manipulate speed of reading by manipulating the linguistic material to be read, and perhaps do particular maneuvers about inhibiting or faster activating lexical items, linguistic information. And I think that there's a possibility of doing that. There's an example, perhaps, from a very recent paper by Rick Peach, where he's trying to target language-specific attention in people with aphasia. And he makes the argument that doing so provides better results than targeting what some people call a domain general attention system. So I think it's possible to target any one of these, which I think are high probable cognitive mechanisms, but there are certainly others that underlie the language performance, what we do to build representations online. Did that help, Julius?
Thank you.
So another question that I had and it was in the beginning of your talk when I was still also looking at some technical things. So forgive me if I missed the mark. But you talked about variance in some of these measures, like the token test, and the variance being an indication not so much of a representational language problem, but more of something else that would interfere, that would be more unstable. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So my question is, do we ever, or have you ever seen performance on these tasks that was completely invariable? And if not, does that mean that language deficits are always subserved by something else? Or does it mean that representational deficits can also be in some way unstable?
Good question, fair question. Yeah, that was the premise, that on the simple revised token test, I mean, that's just one task, we do show that almost all of the deficits that people show are in fact things that they show they can do sometimes. So are there ever, so people usually ask the question, what about so-called global aphasia? Or what about dementia? I think in certain kinds of dementia, perhaps semantic dementia, we might find a lot less variability and a lot less evidence that they actually are able to construct those representations, or that they have those representations. At that point, I can't distinguish between the performance of building representations and retrieving the representation. But let me say that in my clinical and research experience, and I'm not relying on age as evidence here, but I've never seen anyone who couldn't do something sometimes. Even global, even the most severely impaired patients. And in the literature, you'll find references from, I want to say Henry Hitt, but that's not correct, where people have never said a single word, and under the right stimulus conditions said, can say that word, can retrieve a word, or can comprehend a word. We've validated these patterns, this intermittent pattern, which I think is the only real pattern, across many tasks. So I guess it's possible that we could find someone with truly impaired representations, or alternatively, such impaired processing ability that they can never build a representation. But in my experience, that's extremely rare, if ever.
Thank you.
But I would be interested in anyone else's thoughts about that. I'm not married to it.
Right. I have no specific further thoughts to offer except for posing the question.
Well, it's a fair question. And it is at the heart of the argument that I'm trying to make. This is a processing problem, and we need to look for those underlying cognitive deficits that subserve language, that we use to build linguistic representation.
Any other questions from our room here? I don't see questions. Oh, we just as I say this, we have a question online. I don't know if you can see that in your chat box, Mick. Otherwise, I'll be happy to read it out to you.
Let me. I've got to move my chat box here.
I can read it out to you because that means we have it on audio anyway as well for the recording. So it's a question by Kyandi Liu. Thank you so much for the informative talk, Dr. McNeil. I was wondering if you have recommended tasks for reliably measuring working memory. In addition, I'm curious if there are tasks designed for the depth of processing in sentence comprehension.
Well, I wish. We just completed a very large multi-center study looking at short-term memory, working memory, language processing across all domains of language, and tasks that we think measure conflict resolution. And one of the problems that I have interpreting the data is that none of those tasks meet the requirements for looking at the data the way that I would want to, in the sense that I've talked about it here. But having said that, it doesn't mean we can't learn something from good, reliable tests that don't have this high level of intra-subtest homogeneity. And actually, can you see my screen right now?
Yes,
Sure.
we can.
Well, here's a slide from that task. I'm not quite answering the question, but I'm circling it. So in this structural equation model, we first, of course, looked at what factors we could derive. We found a three-factor model that best described the data, the best accounted for the data. And then we looked at, and that three-factor model was where we put all of language processing tasks. And I don't have time to discuss the tasks, so it's going to be kind of shallow unless you know what the tasks are. But semantics, phonological, and syntactic, we have three of each. We had a working memory task, which was an end-back set of tasks designed for phonology, syntax, and semantics. And then we had short-term memory tasks from Nadine Martin that looked at semantics, syntax, and phonology. And the only task that predicted the outcome measure satisfactorily for looking at, for example, object cleft sentences was the working memory tasks. We also, and I also mentioned that we had attention tasks, executive attention tasks, conflict resolution tasks, STRU kinds of tasks. And they did not provide a factor in this study at all, which surprised me. But I also say that this is for accuracy of responses. When we look at response time, we do get factors for attention or for the executive attention functions as well. But nonetheless, back to accuracy. So working memory was the only one that provided a path to understanding object cleft sentences. Let me go back here. And for garden path sentences, the same. Working memory was the only real factor that provided any level of explanation for the garden path sentences. That was a very long answer to say I don't have good tasks for doing that. Task development takes a lifetime. As Dirk mentioned to begin with, I started research on the revised token test in 1972, and I'm still trying to get a handle on it and trying to perfect it. So task development is, if you're as slow as me, a lifetime.
Thank you very much. Oh, I think we do have another question here from the room.
So,
okay.
Again, I'm sorry, I can't stop, but I have a question for you about something that you talked about towards the beginning of your talk. You mentioned the concepts of slow rise time versus cumulative noise. I happen to think that these are very much underappreciated concepts, not just in research, but also probably in clinical practice. So we have several students with us today. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about these concepts, especially since there's almost no research on this, and maybe you know of some research. I first saw this in a book by Berkshire from '86, I think. But as far as I can tell, there really aren't any data on this. Can you know anything more about that?
Well, the only thing I know in terms of data are the things that the studies that I did in combination with some other people, particularly Carlin Hageman. And we tried to parse out how we could manipulate those patterns. We do find slow rise time across 10 items. But what Carlin did was he said, okay, instead of having a 10-item revised token test, let's have 100 items. So he just extended it out. And what he found was there was slow rise time, but then they faded out again, and then they faded in. And so it was the time domain over which the intermittent pattern revealed itself. So it led me to believe that there's really only one reliable pattern, and that's intermittent. But it may be on a different time scale for different individuals. The really interesting question, and if that's true, it doesn't negate the importance of your observation, because you could still have slow rise time even within an item, but across items is what I was talking about. But if you have slow rise time, we've got to find a way to manipulate that so we know what the variable causing it is. I was interested in biological rhythms, and so for a while tried to look at biorhythms in connection with tasks by people with aphasia. I didn't get far enough to make any conclusions on that, but I think it's still valid. It's still a legitimate question. But in terms of performance in general, I think intermittent variability accounts for about 98% of it. Doesn't negate your point though. And there are instances, I mean, there's biological information on habituation and fatigue, and those are two different things. Fatigue occurs when you're giving a series of items and you change the stimulus and the response does not rebound. Habituation, if you have a series of responses and performances going down and you change the stimulus, the response rebounds. So both of those are possible. I know Bob Marshall talked about fatigue a lot, and others have. It's not my research or clinical experience, but I believe it. It's still open, ripe for investigation.
Thank you.
It seems to me also that is exactly where there's great opportunity for the computerized tasks, right? Which might be able to much more quickly online actually figure out whether someone is reaching a plateau, and mark that as something approximating someone's peak ability, right? Which is much harder to, and then maybe stop testing there, or go on and find a pattern in the intermittence.
Yeah, exactly. That's perfect. That's very much in line with the research that Will Evans is doing.
Right.
He's trying to find the sweet spot to know how and when to intervene on tasks.
I don't see other questions online. I don't think we have any others from our room. So thank you very much, Mick. That was great.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.